Dudley.
Hi, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Dudley Music. I hope you guys can hear me out there. If you can hear me, say hello.
Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Hello.
Just one moment, y'all.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dudley. That was a great way to start us off tonight. Even if we are starting a little late, good things are worth waiting for. So thank you. I'm Cynthia Shore, the Executive Director of the Walt Whitman Birthplace, and we are so excited tonight. This is a new breakthrough program. We are collaborating with the Coltrane Home, and we have two of our performers in-house tonight and two are from their homes. So thank goodness for technology bringing us all together, and we're going to show you how to make it work. So I want to thank you for joining us tonight. I want to give out a shout to the Joel Foundation, who is the sponsor for tonight's program, and we're all doing exceptionally well with their sponsorship. We heard about Dudley. Dudley has wonderful music. He's going to be playing with us throughout the evening. And let me introduce our the director or the vice president of the trustees of the Coltrane home, Kathleen Hennessy. And I would like to introduce E.J. Antonio, the poet who's with us tonight, here in the live from Walt Whitman birthplace. And at home, we have Ashley Kahn, who's going to speak on Coltrane. Hello, Ashley, out there. And hello to George Wallace, our poet in residence here, our writer in residence at the Walt Whitman House. And he's going to be speaking on Whitman and poetry. So we have the title tonight is The Intersection of Jazz and Poetry. So we have the music here in-house. We have a poet here in-house. She's also a jazz singer. And we have our two resident lecturers at home out in Wonderland there. So welcome to you all. And I think that we were going to introduce Ashley next to say a few words about the Coltrane home, about Coltrane, about music, about jazz. So I turn it over to you and we shall go to our Zoom.
Thank you, Cynthia. I thought Kathleen was going to say a few words about the home, but am I wrong about that?
I think it's all you, Ashley.
It's all you now.
It's all me. Great. I'm used to this. Hey, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank Cynthia and Kathleen for inviting me along. I've written a few books on John Coltrane. I also teach at NYU as part of the Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music. And in fact, the next course I'll be teaching will be on John Coltrane. And of course, this sort of overlap, intersection, I think is the word we're using tonight, of both John Coltrane and Walt Whitman, by happen chance, both who had various parts of their lives rooted in Long Island, of course, kind of brings it together. But, as the ideas behind a lot of what Walt Whitman and John Coltrane did with their respective approaches to creative expression, it's very easy to talk about the two of them together because they are two incredibly iconic figures to come out of very American forms of expression. Walt Whitman, of course, using poetry and the written word. John Coltrane using recorded sound for the most part and jazz performance, another art form that is rooted in American, that was born here in America. So kind of the overlap of the two of them makes perfect sense. It's not just like, one of those college papers of compare and contrast. And to celebrate the two of them together, kind of cements this idea of the power of creative expression and why we do need to celebrate them and pay attention to their cultural gifts, the gifts that they've left us, and have places that we can actually acknowledge that kind of debt that we have in the case of the Walt Whitman House and the John Coltrane home in Long Island. We need our shrines. We need our cultural shrines. We need to be reminded, that there is a place we can go to and acknowledge, what has been left to us from past generations. In the case of Leaves of Grass, or, which is Walt Whitman's, sort of his magnum opus, and John Coltrane's A Love Supreme, we continue to pass these on to future generations and say, hey, listen to this, read this, make this part of your character, make this part of what you know. and the power of these great cultural, totemic, you know, expressions is something that we do need to cherish and we do need to pass on. Um, what I was going to talk about at the start here, and it's kind of weird to do this because it's almost like I'm doing a lecture, and having come out of 2 years of doing online teaching, it's so weird because I'm not getting any feedback. So if there is anyone out there who wants to stop me and they have a question or a comment they'd like to make, I am so into that. I want to make sure that there are pulses out there, that blood is flowing. So feel free. I do this in my online classes at NYU. Thank God we're back in the classroom though, because this was a stopgap, and not nearly as much learning, I believe, gets happens in this format. But it does have its advantages. I can suddenly be talking to all of you at one time and share a couple of things. By the way, if you are not familiar with "A Love Supreme," John Coltrane's famous 1964 album, in which he professes his own personal philosophy within a musical structure, within a musical context, please do. Please make it something that you're able to integrate into your kind of cultural awareness, as much as Leaves of Grass and other Walt Whitman classics need to be. I'm an English major, by the way. I went to Columbia University, and so you can imagine studying American literature. There's no way to avoid Walt Whitman, as there's no way to avoid John Coltrane if you're going to get into not just jazz, but improvised creative music of the 20th century. They're both such towering figures. There are three major ideas here that I'd like to share with you that really kind of where Walt Whitman's legacy and John Coltrane's legacy overlap. One is definitely this idea of universalism, which had a different kind. Has a different kind of definition when you think of it intellectually versus spiritually. But in both cases, the basic principles behind universalism, the idea of embracing the world in all of its diversity, of putting all of the world, including obviously all peoples, all ethnicities, all religions, on an equal level, was a defining element of both Walt Whitman and John Coltrane. And this is the kind of message that they weave into their writing and the music, the poetry and the recordings that John Coltrane left us. The idea of an individual statement, an individual creative statement reflecting this kind of worldwide philosophy, is something that they share too. The idea of fitting it all into one major poem, an epic poem, or into the format that John Coltrane was working with back in his day, the long playing record. 31 minutes, I believe "A Love Supreme" was, and fitting that whole sort of self-portrait, his own philosophy into a 31-minute piece. And the idea of music filling or creative expression, music and poetry fulfilling this shared spiritual need. So that's number one, the principles of universalism. Another thing that strikes me about both of them is this idea of they both kind of represent this stylistic elevation, that they represent a certain style that they're coming out of, a genre. if you will. In the case of Walt Whitman, whether you call him a romanticist or the beginnings of transcendentalists, of that era, and yet they're so powerful in their individual statements that they rise above it. In John Coltrane's case, of course, we're talking about modern jazz, but in both John Coltrane and Walt Whitman, they're almost genres unto themselves. And those who have followed look at them as kind of transcending their respective genres. I would ask you to kind of put Bob Dylan, on that same level. He's someone who came out of the folk tradition, but then in very short order elevated that style and what was possible in that style. Robert Johnson in the Delta Blues. There are these artists, Bob Marley with reggae. There are many reggae artists, and they're all great, but Bob Marley took that form and elevated it. So that's another way I kind of look at both Walt Whitman and John Coltrane, that they're the stylistic elevation, that there's this artistic possibility within this form that really starts out as a kind of folk art. And then finally, the idea of looking at them as historical bridge builders, coming out of one era and opening up the way to a whole nother, more modern way of thinking about their own particular paths of creative expression. Coltrane coming out of modern jazz, bebop, what many jazz scholars call the soloist's art, which was a big shift away from big bands. And yet what John Coltrane predicts is this whole shift of creative jazz moving towards spirituality. Spiritual jazz, avant-garde, jazz with a message. And that really began, he's really the father of that whole movement. That the kind of emotional and spiritual purpose of the music was moving into a whole nother sense of what this music was meant to do. And of course, it jibed so well with the spirit of the 1960s. So and did he kind of help push the 1960s in that way, or was he just part of that general cultural wave? That's a whole nother rabbit hole. We don't have to go down that. But it's this idea that it's the right person at the right time, and the same with Walt Whitman. Coming out of the realism of the early 1800s, and then predicting the transcendentalists of the latter part of that century, and he is building that bridge towards that. And then finally, those are the kind of three areas that come to my mind as to how to think about these masters. But there's also the idea that music and poetry, are interlinked, and that the way we speak and that the way that we kind of listen to other people speak, that we're using the same muscles and the same ideas are taking place, whether it's poetry, which is meant to be spoken and meant to be heard live, as well as music. And to that, idea, John Coltrane, of course, dug very much into the idea in the 1960s of using the written word as an inspiration for his jazz expression. One of the perfect examples is using a Martin Luther King speech, which he was reading from a Black newspaper back in 1963 after the bombings in Birmingham that killed 4 school children, and creating out of that speech the tune Alabama, which in that, in 1963, if you said Alabama, everybody knew what you meant. Like right now, if you said Will Smith, everybody knows what you mean, you know, because it was viral. That was the incredible pivotal moment in the civil rights era when those 4 school children were killed in the firebombing in Birmingham. And so taking that historical moment, and by the way, I strongly ask you to go and check out the tune now, especially given all the violence that's in the headlines today, and kind of get a feel for what the vibe is, for where John Coltrane is coming from. It's a very, very specific kind of emotion that he is developing on that very short tune. It's on the album John Coltrane at Birdland, and it's called Alabama. And so in that same way, you know, I know that Walt Whitman, I can't speak to the specifics of his historical period, but I can say that the idea of finding the rhythm and the space and the cadence of spoken word in his free verse had a lot to do with kind of shifting away from the forms and structures and opening up the music, if you will, of his poetry. And John Coltrane was exactly the same way too. So that's my mini lecture. This will be on the final. You're all responsible for it. But I will stop now, and if you know there are any questions or whatever, I'd be happy to let you guys join the conversation.
You guys can put them in the chat or unmute yourself, raise your hand. I'm here watching. So
I know there was a lot there. I was really pushing the bandwidth for my little moment here. And I do want to thank you guys, by the way, for being very patient with the technical setup and hanging in there. It's great to see you all.
I hope can you guys hear me well from that? Can you hear me now? Okay. Yeah, just tagging off of what you were just saying. As a jazz artist, as a saxophonist, and as a writer, of course, Coltrane is such a pivotal artist, a staple, and someone who you have to know about if you are studying jazz, you know, and not just because he was so popular, but because the choices, the innovation that he had into the genre really changed the way that we even, you know, look at jazz, the way that we treat jazz, the way that we treat especially improvisation. And to speak a little bit on Walt Whitman, I can't say too much as I'm not the biggest student, but being raised and growing up on Long Island, and also, you know, if you guys don't know, I'm also a hip hop MC. So I you know, hip hop is really an extension of poetry. And when I'm studying how to write, how to come up with ideas, and I really think a lot outside of the box when it comes to writing lyrics, we think about these different devices in poetry. When we talk about poetry, it's Walt Whitman, you know. And so being a resident here, I'm so honored and inspired by people like Coltrane, people like Walt Whitman, who lay a good foundation as to what's possible. And I think that as a younger artist, I'm 30 years old now. I guess I'm not that young anymore. So, you know, I see the
Younger,
right? So you know, seeing artists that are up and coming, even on the mainstream, and seeing their creativity expressed in their playing, in their writing, and knowing absolutely knowing that it came from these two. I'm not even going to say people like them. These two creatives. They don't, they're as big as it gets. And so being in the presence of that is inspiration in itself. When I got to visit the Coltrane home and see this is where he created Love Supreme and other things, it just blew my mind, and it made me reflect on my own life. The biggest thing, my biggest takeaway from the story and life of Coltrane too, is that a lot of people don't know, and I didn't know this until I studied a little deeper into him, is that he kind of was a late bloomer. And a lot of times we think that if you want to be great at something, you have to be born great. And I do believe that to an extent, but I do believe that that there's a lot of hard work and meditation that you have to do to transcend like these two have. So when I look at and listen to things about John Coltrane's life and seeing that he was not the best at a point, and he had to, I remember seeing, I forget who it was, but someone would see him walking around with a book, and they didn't thought it was a notebook, I think, or they didn't know why, what he was doing, but or he was just fingering stuff on his saxophone, and he's there studying rudiments and scales and different melodies, so that he can improvise better, so that he can perform and get and elevate himself. So I'm just I just want to say how honored I am to know about these legends and to be able to reflect their work into what I do, even if it's a fraction. I think that we have no choice but to emulate what they did, because they were so huge. So whether you like it or not, you have Coltrane in you, you have Walt Whitman in you, you have these amazing figures from Long Island that are influencing our world. So that's all I got to say about those two. And yeah, I'm just honored to be here.
If I could say something, since Ashley invited us to say it, I came across a quote that's attributable to Pablo Picasso, and the quote is, "Inspiration exists, but it has to find you working." And I'm always intrigued by that, and I'm intrigued by the novelty of this idea of that there's a nexus between Whitman and Coltrane. And I try to put it in another litmus. It'd be like Charles Bukowski being linked up with Wynton Marsalis. There's a possibility there, I think, because of meter. I was wondering, Ashley, if you could draw some correlation, because there has to be a linkage between the words and the melodic line. And what is that magic between Whitman and the magic between Coltrane, if you so indulge?
Yeah, no, great question. Great question. I'm laughing because I'm just wondering, between Bukowski and Marsalis, what bar would they meet at, and what would be the overlap? But and by the way, I'm a fan of both as well. The idea that we compartmentalize creative expression into, these things that we call the arts. The idea that this is what poetry should be and look like and how it should flow, etc. This is what prose should be like. This is what jazz needs to sound like to be called jazz. What I love about these two figures is that they find this, especially in that kind of universalist idea, that creative expression is creative expression. Where John Coltrane is drawing from is not just, I mentioned one example with Alabama. He's out of the black church. He's out of a long line of preachers. And I remember once talking to Wayne Shorter and doing an interview with him for a different book, not a John Coltrane thing, but we got to talking about John Coltrane. And he said, you know, if you listen to him soloing, you can hear that he's coming from preachers. In other words, not singers, as most very melodic saxophonists do. They're coming more from like singing the lines, the melodic lines. John Coltrane was definitely someone who, if you listen to Love Supreme, especially the opening piece, Acknowledgement, it sounds like preaching. It's, you know, it repeats certain phrases, etc., etc. And both Whitman and Coltrane were about breaking down the walls, not only between categories of writing or categories of music, but between categories of performing arts and categories of communication. You know, the human construct, the way we listen and the way we hear things before we're told how to compartmentalize, well, that's music. That's someone speaking. That's someone yelling. That's your mother telling you, not to touch the stove, or whatever. Before any of that happens, most or many, creative geniuses like a Miles Davis, like a John Coltrane, try and get back to that original pre-cognitive, categorization state of pure expression. So the idea that there would be a sort of common vocabulary, the rhythm, the flow of speaking and music makes perfect sense. And I believe very strongly there's a, one of my favorite composers coming out of the jazz tradition, although he would never call himself a jazz artist, is Henry Threadgill. And he has said, when you hear my music, I want you to forget about jazz. I want you to forget that it's a saxophone. I want you to forget that it's an electric guitar. I don't want any of that stuff to be there. I want you to hear sound as it's coming to you. And I believe that's, the one thing here is the idea that, with words, you get a very specific message. With music, it's much more interpretive. It's a much more kind of interactive way of dealing with that inspiration. So it's a great question you ask, and I think it goes to the heart of what creative expression is all about. And especially when you get artists who think on a very conceptual level and want to break down the forms and structures out of which they're coming to really get into the heart and soul of whoever's listening or reading their work, etc. That's when you get someone on the level of a Walt Whitman or a John Coltrane.
Thank you, Ashley, for that answer. We'll come back to the Q&A at the end, but George Wallace is going to speak for us right now. Next.
Okay, thank you. I'm just looking to see if I'm on that big screen behind you. I'm not sure that I am.
We'll switch you over. Give me a second.
Great. Thank you, Ashley. That was fabulous. I could say, what he said to a certain extent, maybe 15% of what Ashley said, but I have a more nuts and bolts thing to talk about, and it's a little bit more from the perspective of Walt Whitman. So I'm going to give you my 15 minutes, and I'm going to start with a very short passage from Walt Whitman's Salute au Monde. Salute au Monde. What do you see, Walt Whitman? I see all the menials of the earth laboring. I see all the prisoners in the prisons. I see the defective human bodies of the earth, the blind, the deaf and dumb, idiots, hunchbacks, lunatics, pirates, thieves, betrayers, murderers, slave makers of the earth, the helpless infants, and the helpless old men and women. I see male and female everywhere. I see the serene brotherhood of philosophers. I see ranks colors, barbarisms, civilizations. I go among them. I mix indiscriminately, and I salute all the inhabitants of the earth. You, whoever you are, all you continentals of Asia, Africa, Europe, Australia, indifferent place, all you on the numberless islands of the archipelagos of the sea, and you of centuries hence, when you listen to me, and you, each and every one, where whom I specify not, but include just the same, health to you, goodwill to you all, from me and America sent, each of us inevitable, each of us limitless, each of us with his or her right upon the earth, each of us allowed the eternal purports of the earth, each of us here as divinely as any is here, toward you all. In America's name, I raise high the perpendicular hand. Walt Whitman.
George Wallace.
Now, sheets of music, sheets of words, getting with the flow. I'm going to give you a little bit of theory and a little bit of Whitman and Coltrane, presenting you a few thoughts about improvisation, inspiration, grounding, and discipline of craft in jazz and poetry. So this is a nuts and bolts presentation. It, as you know, many of you know, it's 7 miles by car from the world-renowned birthplace of the John Coltrane home. A 15-minute drive. Google Map didn't want to tell me that, by the way, at first, because it thought that I was still in Philadelphia at AWP. But of course, the distance from Whitman to Coltrane is measured not in physical miles or in years separating them, or the experience of the differing experience of American socio-political culture. It is about creative distance. Answering the question of distances and closenesses we might find between Whitman and Coltrane then is a matter of using the right mapping tool. Can you get there from here? What are the pathways beyond the Googleable roadways from Old Whitman Road to Candlewood Path? What pathways may we establish between these two artistic giants on the American cultural landscape? Attention, and what I'm going to present to you today is to show that the artistic connection between Whitman and Coltrane is a profound one, is a strong one, is mappable, and reveals to us a proximity between these two men as close as the physical closeness of their two homes in West Hills and separated by 50 to 100 years, depending on what point in time we start, and a wide sociocultural divide between the two. Their marked similarities in their foundational concerns and devotion to combine discipline and craftsmanship with a mind-bending love of freestyling and layering on of ideas and sounds. What do Whitman and Coltrane share?
This is
A foundation in the progressive spirituality of their times. I say it again, a foundation in the progressive spirituality of their times. A devotion to craftsmanship and disciplined improvisational technique. A go-ahead love of adding to their artistic palette. And perhaps most importantly, features that mark both these artistic giants as true exemplars of classic American values and beliefs. The power and dignity of the individual, as Ashley mentioned. The limitless drive of the optimistic and the curious. The unshakable confidence that comes from being heirs to and inheritors to a combination of rich national wealth and religiosity, which Ashley alluded to. Let's look at first at the philosophical underpinnings of these two men. Whitman was steeped in the hip thinking of his time. He was rooted in Quakerism. He was rooted in the Enlightenment and Protestantism of the Enlightenment. But he found his home in Transcendentalism, which, by the way, he picked up and learned from Thoreau. An inclusive universalism, yes, that celebrated all manifestations of existence. He drew inalterable connections between all things and celebrated the harmonic resemblance between the self and the myriad manifestations of soul existence in the material world. So, in his own way, did Coltrane in his own century, raised in the religious environment of a North Carolina preacher's home. He possessed a 20th century eclectic drive to extend himself out into the universe, enfolding a new age pan-ecumenicalism for himself and in his music. Both of them hip and new, but steeped in traditional religiosity. Everything, all items within the universe, everything connected through chains of correspondence, nothing existing in isolation, musical notes and phrases, musical ideas, poetic conceptions, words themselves, all turning in and around themselves, through each other and beyond, and taking us with them. Consider the similarity of their respective modes of exploration, collection, organization of material, emotional, intellectual, spiritual material. Coltrane explores new modalities of music, rapidly changing chords, engages in a complex exploration and extension of harmonic implications to every note in every chord scale in the series of songs that he employed. Whitman, in his exhaustive cataloging, very important, similarly celebrates and declares himself one and the same with the particular and the universal, in a dizzying aggregation of facts that defies reduction to a simple fact or even dissection. Both Coltrane and Whitman adhere to Clark Coolidge's dictum about poetry and jazz. In improvisation, one needs to be able to jump in anywhere, tease the core, and know where to land. You go with the grain, you go against the grain, you go across the grain, you go through the grain, you invent the grain, you become the grain, says Clark Coolidge. So too, both of these gentlemen are elusive in their compositional approach, hearkening to a rich vocabulary that's at their command. So it's not just unique to see illusion at work in artists, of course, writers, musicians, visual artists. In fact, Coltrane engages in a pure contrafact, taking the tune "How High the Moon" and turning the chord progression into his tune "Satellite," which superimposes a new tune over that chord progression. That's something Charlie Parker did with the same song, "How High the Moon." Ornithology, his theme song, is based on and written over the top of "How High the Moon." And in literature, think about Arthur Lorentz' West Side Story to Romeo and Juliet, or Tom Stoppard, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to Hamlet. These are full superimpositions, but more characteristically and surprisingly, both Whitman and Coltrane are elusive to a lesser extent. They make casual and deliberate nods to other works. They quote short passages. They engage in quasi-homage to other artists and other speakers and other forms of dialogue. Whitman's poems grow organically from the subject matter and the language that he has employed, which is the opposite of taking a form and then fitting the subject matter into the form. His poems grow organically. That's why they spread across the page. They obey a dictum stated by Emerson in 1842, which he had paid close attention to. Laying out across the page has a visual and it has an oratorical function. It also sets the stage, as we know, for what comes later, for the performative moment, which occurs during the actual composition of a poem for a poet. For Whitman, the writing process is the performative moment. Whereas for the improvisational musician, that moment occurs on stage or in a recording studio. But in both cases, the performance is not random. The performance is not haphazard. The performance is not unschooled. These are artists who have woodshedded their craft. I'll come back to that meaning of the word woodshed in a second. Whitman worked and reworked his technique and his individual poems assiduously, basing his voice on many things, including biblical language, including the social and political oratory of the day, and the gift of the gab that he learned hanging with the Irish boys in the Five Points and throwing a little Creole and French flavor from his experience in New Orleans into the mix. When Whitman was at his best, the catalogs that he made are not just expansive, exhilarating things. Stylistically, they're controlled, they're unified. That's much more so than they seem upon first encounter. Despite their appearance as spontaneous outpourings and random miscellaneous inclusion of different factoids, they're connected by both logic and grammar. The catalogs relate one thing to another through a chain of associated thought and sound relationships. Critics argue whether Whitman's poems are essentially oral or visual in quality. Certainly, the sweeping broad lines of the first edition emphasize the visual aspect of his poetry. His eye sweeps across a page. Skimming seems almost unavoidable because of the length and the repetition. But taking the time to slow down and examine the individual components or groups of components in a great Whitman poem, it yields a wealth of rewards and appreciation for the craftsmanship of a man who was one part journalist in New York City, one part visionary, and one part wood joiner, a craftsman like his father. Coltrane, now, well known for his workaholic devotion to practice, is said to have emerged as Coltrane being Coltrane as an outcome of his 1957 coming clean from drugs. That period when he distilled an approach and a palette that was distinctly his own. Critics note that year as being the one where the saxophonist most particularly exhibited his passion to practice incessantly, leading to his signature style. What is it? Slaloming through changes, playing and replaying scalar patterns, offering an outpouring of harmonic stacking that critic Ira Gitler famously dubbed sheets of sound. We know this for many years as people taking off from popular songs from the American Songbook and just building around it and taking off the core and building around it as some improvisational moment. Like I say, taking off, going off up for a while and coming down, landing back on that core tune. But whether it is founded in the core of a song that he has written, or like Favorite Things or countless other recorded pieces of Coltrane's from the American Songbook, his enunciation of dense, rapid changing chords with complex extensions built upon each note in the chord. In each chord, that's no freestyle stream of consciousness act. That's core bound, tangential, weaving, and more. One repeated modality for Coltrane is a kind of spiritual, religious, meditative sonority. As I mentioned, Love Supreme, Om are very great examples. Coltrane went from incorporating African traditions, spirituals, blues elements, to incorporating in classical European, classical South Asian musical traditions. His ability to draw inspiration and add to his palette from a variety of musical traditions was evident, especially on his album India Ascension, and of course in A Love Supreme, which was released in '64, soon became successful. Here's what's important and what I want to say about woodshedding. As Charlie and Parker demonstrates, the competent improvisational artist, the competent one, whether it's a poet in the midst of writing or the saxophonist in the midst of wailing a tune, is successful because he or she has internalized the compositional moment, into the performative moment. Early Charlie Parker was laughed off the stage as a 17-year-old in Kansas City. He retired to his mother's woodshed and he mastered his craft for a year and a half. When he finally came back and stepped up to the same stage, he had the chops to blow everybody away, made everybody shut up and listen. It's because of crafting. It's because of the ability to take that improvisational crafting and turn that into the performative moment. We don't, after all, necessarily find in the superstructural composition of Love Supreme what is most important or most amazing about Coltrane's most remarkable achievement. Rather, that's what he does with a core composed tune in this case, or from the American Songbook, or other songs from his own pen. The in-the-moment improvisational complexity and prowess of his moves. That's what we're enamored by and impressed by. This extension of mastery of subject into the performative moment is something we can directly assess to Whitman's compositional style. We may explore the similarities in compositional technique between Coltrane and Whitman. In a sense, both tease the core of standards to their repertoire. Far from random or haphazard, the phrasing choices, as I said before, is an organic growth and the product of intense workshopping. Both have achieved mastery over the conceptual core, the process of phrase choice. For both Whitman and Coltrane, their personal philosophical frameworks all-embracing, transcendental, universally expanding, results in this ability to create new material in a manner that escapes the gravitational bonds of subject, that goes beyond repetition, that goes beyond worn-out cliche because of its expansive nature. Go back in for a minute or two, and I have 15 minutes, so there's a somewhat deeper dive into pattern, structure, and vocabulary. We know that Whitman could spit with the best of them in New York City in the 1840s and 1850s. He hung out with and considered himself one of the roughs, sorting with immigrant barflies, street brawlers, firemen, dock workers, stagecoach drivers, leaping into carriages for a little raucous shout out with the team driver. For much as he talked the street talk, his vocabulary was steeped in biblical passages, particularly the use of parallelism. Preaching he heard from Elias Hicks, the Hicksite Quakerite from Westbury, his own personal childhood preacher. And as a reporter deeply enmeshed in the politics of his day, week by week, day by day, absorbing the oratorical style of the day. This formal patterning of devices of anaphora, repetition, front-loaded verbal choices, the seasoning of New Orleans experience Creole into that, are omnipresent in his work, and it's quite easy. If you take a prose passage from people like Father Taylor, Daniel Webster, Edward Everett, Emerson, Thoreau, or abolitionist Lydia Marie Child, even Charles Dickens, who came to New York City and wrote about his visit to New York City, you can read in the cadence and the technique of their prose passages, the exact thing that Whitman is turning into poetry. And he inserted it, you could insert one of these passages virtually undetectable into a Whitman poem, and you wouldn't even be able to be completely spliceless. In the end, Whitman's list poems, his catalog poems, are particularly conducive to other people writing poetry at the time. We're not doing it. Not incidentally, they said, well, this is, looking to the future from him, they set the foundation for Cubist deconstruction, juxtaposition, impressionist, expressionist laying on of linguistic brushstrokes, and everything from James Joyce and William Faulkner to the bop prosody favored by Ginsberg, Kerouac, and other beats. Meanwhile, Coltrane, who took jazz from the level of riffing off standard songs, running tangents, parallel melodic wanderings, to tease the core song. Past bebop, past modern jazz, he took it to a next level, and he paved the way for his successors. His harmonic explorations extended well beyond bending the melodic line of an established chord progression. Exploring previously uncharted modal progressions, intent, rapid fire exploring of every possible harmonic implication, every single note and every single chord, and laying it all out in an open field in a rapid fire manner that astonished listeners in his day and astonishes us today. This is a prodigious layering on of musical, applying a profusion of brushstrokes that have logic and discipline to their individual utterances, and in the aggregate, achieve an amazing composite effect. I ask you this, do the individual dots in a pointillist painting possess this kind of disciplined knowledge and alliance to influence? Does a single drop or splash and a jack? It's fair to say that any one of Coltrane's multiplicities of musical phrases, any single image or phrase from Whitman's all-inclusive composite of catalog images has been chosen by a craftsman and can lead us into the singular and from the singular to the universal. And that's what they are doing that the other people are not doing. Thus it is that one might delight simultaneously in the particulars of the work of either of these two artists, and at the same time in the juxtaposition and insights of them, emotional, intellectual, spiritual, in the sequencing, in the progression and flow, in the overall aggregation of what is presented in the catalog. Bottom line, Whitman and Coltrane have leapt the shark. Both of them leapt the shark. They went from casual spitting and improvisational freestyle that teases the choral to a schooled and philosophically advanced craftsmanship that retains the freshness of improvisation to this day. It's no mere spontaneous, random, abstract selection process work. It's the work of craftsmen of a solid base vocabulary. It's the work of a craftsman with an insatiable curiosity, which leads them to expand that vocabulary. It's the accomplishment of people who have workshopped a highly advanced and individualized book of sources and are capable of delivering a sample of them with lightning-like rapidity from that existing vocabulary. When it works, as we know, John Coltrane and Whitman in their own fields reach that nuclear moment of fusion, where the combination of training and vision leads to exploration, discovery, composition, and utterance that can be called truly original. And that, ladies and gentlemen, for better or worse, is a place that Google Maps cannot take. Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dudley. Let's take a moment here and have a round of applause for everyone tonight. We have our Dudley, terrific. And I haven't been doing big introductions tonight. As you know, the bios are linked on the flyer that we send out. So please do look. The Ashley and George both have a traditional and a tremendous resume, and very accomplished, both of them. And thank you very much for your presentations. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our poet of the evening, E.J. Antonio. And if you'll permit me, since we have a break here, I do want to offer somewhat of an introduction for E.J. All right. So E.J. has received fellowships in poetry from the New York Foundation for the Arts, the Hurston Wright Foundation, and the Kahn Foundation. She's appeared as a feature reader and performer at venues in the New York tri-state area, including Why Not Jazz Room, Arts Westchester, the Stone, the Hobart Festival of Women's Writers, the Vision Festival, and the Langston Hughes House. Her work has been published in various journals, magazines, and anthologies. She's the author of 2 chapbooks, Every Child Knows and Solstice, and a solo jazz poetry CD, Rituals in the Marrow, Recipe for a Jam Session. She is founding member of the Jazz and Poetry Choir Collective, which released its debut CD, We Were Here in Spring 2020. And she is a founding board member of the nonprofit arts organization, One Breath Rising. It gives me great pleasure to introduce EJ, who is not only a poet, but she's a jazz singer, and hopefully we'll get some of her rhythm going up here and get it with Dudley music, and we'll all have a wonderful roundup to the evening. EJ, thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out tonight, signing in to the Zoom meeting. Some of the discussion that went on before was very personal to me. When they said Coltrane was influenced by a lot of preachers and reverends in his family and whatnot. Well, turns out my grandmother and my grandfather were pastors of churches. My grandfather unfortunately died when I was around 5 years old. My grandmother was a pastor of her church for 30 years before she retired, and she didn't stop preaching. She just moved back down south. Her church was in Harlem. Then when she moved back down south after she retired, she still was preaching up until her 90s. So when I first started writing poetry, I was just writing poetry. And I would go to readings and people would say, it sounds like you're singing when you're reading. And I never knew what they were talking about. But I just kept doing what I'm doing. And then one day, one of the poets arranged for me to do a collaboration with a musician by the name of Mark Taylor, who used to play jazz French horn. And that was the first time I actually worked with musicians. And it clicked like after the second stanza of the poem. That just kept going from there. So it still keeps going, you know? So I'm going to start with a poem that I wrote that honors the matriarch in the universe. And it's called Matriarch. Someone sang for me. From behind her teeth, the sound of blood's rush called me from myself into myself, a body, an earth song of love and bitterness. Someone sang for me, amazing grace. Deep in Virginia pines, a hymn razored the sky vermilion, pushed the wind to shove me down a snake-filled road, fighting for my life. Someone sang for me, how sweet the sound, how sweet, sweet the sound. Someone sang for me, pulled all my am and am not from origin's darkest beginnings. Melody flowed through me, planted itself in me. I heard a soprano rustling leaves in my ear. Amazing. Someone sang for me, rattled the question in my voice, shook loose words from my hands. The pine cones buried in Virginia woods, I've always known someone sang for me. Sang for me, amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Someone sang for me, an oath shivered agreement, sacrificed their pope for me to write down all the songs. Someone sang for me, as I will sing for her, the someone of me. coming after me. Amazing grace. Now, I told George I was going to do this. I've read Whitman. I'm not a student of Whitman. I'm more out of the tradition of Yusef Kuminyaka, Sekou Sundiata, Wanda Coleman, those types of poets. And when I first heard those poets read, I heard the music in their words. And I heard the thing that people said they heard when they hear me read, which is they think they hear me singing, even though I'm not singing. And I found out that when you do an introspective on what it is that you do, what I found for myself was that my reading performance style is very much rooted in my grandmother's preaching. My grandmother was what they called a whooping minister, which means they get so deep into the sermon that they reach a pitch in their voice that sounds like they're singing when they're really not. And then I get my phrasing, what I call my jazz phrasing. I actually get that from Nancy Wilson, because as a kid, I lived in Nancy Wilson's Tender Loving Care album. I knew it by heart at 10, okay? And I actually, when I got older, and we no longer had the album, I found it as a CD when they were releasing CDs of old albums. And I'm on the train going to work and she's singing something, and then she did something with her voice, and I was like, whoa, that's where I got that from. Because Nancy Wilson sometimes does that. It sounds like she's singing, but she's not really singing. She's talking, yeah. So anyway, I went and found, I looked at Walt Whitman's Song of Myself, and I picked 2 stanzas from it. That's a very long poem. It's actually 52 parts to it. It's very long. So I took the first 2 stanzas of the 21st part. So I'm going to read those 2 stanzas straight, and then I'm going to ask Dudley to come up here and improv with me, because we're going to try and do improvisation in Whitman's, those 2 stanzas of Whitman's poem. Okay. Song of Myself, the 1892 version. I am the poet of the body, and I am the poet of the soul. The pleasures of heaven are with me, and the pains of hell are with me, and the first I graft and increase upon myself, the latter I translate into a new tongue. I am the poet of the woman, the same as the man. And I say it is as great to be a woman as to be a man. And I say there is nothing greater than the mother of men. I am a poet of the body, the body, the body, the body, the body, the body, the body. And I am a poet of the soul. The pleasures of heaven are with me, and the pains of hell are with me. And they're with me, with me, with me. And I am the poet of the woman, the same as the man, the same as the man. And I say it is as great to be a woman as to be a man. It is great to be a woman, to be a woman. And there is nothing greater than the mother of man. There is nothing greater than the mother, the mother. I am the poet of the body, and the pleasures of heaven are with me. The first I grab and increase upon myself, I translate to a new tongue. woman the same as the man. And I say it is as great to be a woman as to be a man, as to be a man, as to be a man. And I say there is nothing greater than the mother of men. There's nothing greater than the mother of men. Because I am a poet of the soul, of the soul. And the pains of hell are with me. And I translate into a new tongue. Because I am a poet of the woman. And I am not the same as a man. I am a poet of the woman. And I say it is as great to be a woman as to be a man. And I say there is nothing greater. There is nothing greater. There is nothing greater than the mother. And the mother. And the mother. And the mother. There's nothing greater than the mother of men. There's nothing greater. There is nothing greater because I am a poet of the body. A poet of the soul. And the pleasures of heaven are in me, and the pains of hell are in me, and the first breath that I increase upon myself, and I translate into a new tongue. Because I am a poet of the body. I'm a poet of the body. I'm a poet of the body. I'm a poet of the soul. I'm a poet of the body. I'm a poet of women and men. And it is as great to be women. And it is great to be men. And I say there is nothing greater than the of women and men. I am a poet of the body. I'm a poet of the soul. I'm a poet of the woman. I'm a poet of men. And I say it is great to be woman and great to be man. And there is nothing greater. There is nothing greater. There's nothing greater than the mother. Than the mother. Than the mother. I live in improvisation. I write my poems out. I never repeat my poems the same way twice. When I did my first CD, I took 7 free jazz musicians, including Mr. Christian McBride, who graciously said he would play on my first CD, into a studio, and we did 8 hours straight. We did 14 tracks, and we had no music. All they had was 45 pages of poems that they put on the music stick. And we hit it.
Wow.
So the CD sounds as if we're in the jazz club at the Improv at the after hour. And that's how I like to do stuff. I don't particularly like doing a lot of rehearsing, all of that, because it's kind of not organic to me if you rehearse it too much. And that's how I came to be known as a jazz poet. My musicians call me that. They look at my poetry and they say I leave space for music. So I tend to write as though they write jazz composition, the way they write their jazz compositions. If I'm using words. Exactly. I do not usually do form. In that case, Walt Whitman has influenced my life because I live in free verse, even though I can write form. I live in free verse. And I've always been attracted to the sound of poetry. There are some poets who can take the sound, can not really hear the sound of poetry. They don't like reading with music going on or anything. It's just what's written on the page, and they don't veer from it. It just stays that way. That's never been me. So I just, do what comes naturally to me. Like I said, I can't separate the sound from the actual words on the page. And the more I study sound, be it free jazz, be it gospel, be it R&B, be it Latin music, the more intrigued I am by it. I was given a writing prompt one time that said, write about the human body. And so I said, well, I wonder what the smallest muscle is in the human body. It turns out it's in your feet. And without it, we would shatter, because what it does is it controls all of the sounds that the body actually makes so that it is not killing us. And I was like, ooh, interested. Yeah. But I live in the sound of poetry. I live in the improvisation of it, even if I do write my own. But if you can improv in poetry, you could just, if you can find that space in the poetry or the music, and Walt Whitman left some space in these two stanzas here, that I could do that.
That was fun.
Yeah.
Beautiful. I find it, I've only had a few, actually when I started performing, I started by going to a lot of open mics and things, mostly where there was more poets than there were musicians. So I had a lot of experience seeing spoken word artists perform, and what I envy the most about spoken word and poetry is that outside of what, I wouldn't say outside of jazz, because jazz does that very much so, but outside of especially popular music, poetry has the ability to go wherever it pleases. There's a lot of freedom in it. When we talk about music, a lot of times we're stuck in a rhyme scheme, a lot of times with our music, which means the next stanza if it has to rhyme, then there's only a few things that we could say, that will keep going that way. If we're stuck in a rhythm or a pattern, there's only so many syllables that we can fit into a sentence, into a presentation. But poetry and jazz is so pure, especially when it is improvised, that you have the ability to go in endless amount of ways. But I find it, and I have had a few times where I have worked on recordings with poets, and I always tell them, record your voice first, and then I'll go based on what you're doing, because the rhythm that comes from the poet is so original. It has its own inflections, its own rhythms, that I find it so I found it fun, just like just now in the few minutes that we were doing that I'm hearing the phrases that you were repeating and seeing, okay, this would sound good if I did this, and I feel like it's very inspirational from my side to be able to follow what a poem is. And I was also listening to the words you were saying too, to convey an emotion too. So I had a lot of fun.
Well, the poet, there's this, the improvisation that Coltrane had, Whitman, to an extent, was also improv because he's not sticking to the forms of the time. He's creating this free verse format. When you get the poet and the music together, there should be this synergy. It's got to be a synergy. One is not leading the other. They're simultaneously existing, and they should blend into a synergistic sound, actually. I'm going to read a poem that I wrote called On the Underside of the Brooklyn Bridge. You can feel free to jump in and read it. As a matter of fact, this poem just showed up in the anthology that George just edited. And George will tell us the name completely because it changed names. Echoes from jazz albums, drips from concrete columns, puts the Hanks on notice, calls them one by one to stand judged. All their transgressions caught in the dark matter of 32nd and 16th notes. On the underside of the Brooklyn Bridge, graffiti collides with the low tones of a bass, washing the worn down docks clean of their crumb. And the shadows are dancing with ladies of the evening and the stormy skies as their Johns refuse to pay and their pimps refuse to accept the truth. Don't nobody win if the tide don't Argentine tango. On the other side of the Brooklyn Bridge, speak easy, stomp and jive hangs heavily in the roadway's steel necks. Safety. Safety suspended. And the ghost of the East and the West rivers praise the passing of melody's golden notes. Remove the tarnish from a girl child, found hunched in the dust, underdressed, trying to escape. Her name, a mystery. Her life pulled from the rivets too frail to hold it. On the other side of the Brooklyn Bridge, the sax plays a ballad of cobblestone. Some dimpled by stiletto heels of wannabe socialites. Others brushed and buffed smooth by minks, dragged in after hours. Dragged in after hours. By couples looking for love. Looking for love before the jam ended, before the tide rolled out the reality. Their youthful smiles turned into old everyday excuses and insatiable yearnings for the dream never caught. Brooklyn Bridge. He is a flash in a warehouse window. Shadow dancing. His arms move from memory. He sees her shimmy a song as if we in arms. And he tries again. He hits redial on the phone, holds on until the voice on the answering machine turns to and it's another sleepless night, holding his transgressions inside. She never forget me. On the underside of that bridge, y'all. Every day there is bass and minor scale, sax and major scale, piano and please, drum and ringtone. There is trumpet and flute every night. There is an endless lullaby. On the other side of the Brooklyn Bridge, y'all. Every night, there's an endless lullaby for the foolish, the damned, the innocent, the guilty, the guilty. On the underside of the Brooklyn Bridge. I'm going to end with this poem I wrote. It's a new poem. It's called Macondo Music. One of the founders of One Breath Rising used to be married to Macondo. And so I got into his music and said, well, let me see if I could write a poem. So this is the poem that I wrote. Yeah. I cursed the wind when it cheated, stole my elders from my sight, left worry's dark matter on my skin. It's blemished, reminded me of absence, reminded me forever lasts long enough to spawn new, because nothing lives without the dark to share it. Man, don't you hear me in these trees? I've praised rain, hoped its wetness will shake the invisible, and it laughed at me from the horns. Carried me to the mud shed, drying into the stone-colored infinity of gray, holding hostage the flesh of discarded worlds. Woman, don't you see me rising from this mist? I've ambushed the sun, beat it to Tangelo pulp, mixed it with a little funk from the band, and it saved me from the distance widening in my body. Sound winding through a tangle of muscle, twisting tight sharps in minor scales. And bones craving unconstrained, joyous major scales as I fought to be a natural moving through the earth. Child, don't you feel me shaking your ears open? Don't you feel me shaking your ears open to listen, listen to the rainbow singing? I've cursed the wind when it cheated me. Man, don't you hear me in these trees? I've praised the rain, hoped its wetness will shake the invisible, and it laughed at me. Laughed at me from the horn's bell. Woman, don't you see me rising, rising, I've ambushed the sun. Beat it to tangible pulse, mixed it with a little funk from a band. And it saved me. And it saved me. Child, don't you feel me shaking your ears open? Don't you feel me shaking your ears open, open, open? Don't you hear the rainbow singing? Thank you. Yeah, very well together. Tilting off.
All right, well, for our first evening of improv, the intersection of jazz and poetry, I think we did okay, right? I think so. The audience was terrific, and our performers that wrapped up the evening were fantastic. Thank you, EJ, and thank you, Dudley, and thank you, George and Ashley over my shoulder here. You know, I was thinking about putting this together, and I had this vision in my head, and of course, even though I like to say I'm a writer, I couldn't get it out. And so when EJ and Dudley were here, and George and Ashley were not, so I was saying to them, you know, why don't you do something? Let's do something. And exactly the vision I had, even though I couldn't articulate it, came out. So thank you very much. Maybe it just went out through the airwaves. Who knows how artists works. But fantastic. I do want to give a shout out to our wonderful technicians who are here tonight. Megan, Megan on the sunset, and Anthony Jackson back here. Thank you so much. I couldn't have done without you and getting all of this technology. In front of me, I see 3 screens, about 16 microphones. And so how they manage this all, I don't know, but you did a terrific job. So thank you. Stagehands, thanks. And thanks again to everyone who joined us tonight, and for our performers and our speakers. It was a wonderful evening. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That's a good idea. Okay.
Thank you all.
In front of the stage.
Bye. Thank you.
Hey, thank you for the patience and understanding and being good to us. So
Thank you. Good night.
bye.
Good night, Ashley. Good night, George.